Of course, first of all, thank you, Irit, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for showing up today. These are here and ones online as well. And yeah, so giving me this opportunity to present this new research framework that I'm trying to develop, which deals with the question whether and how we can speak of any aspects of decolonization in the era of neoliberalism that we all live in today, and we know its impact. And I think I would like to start actually with maybe a bit of a detour. So if we look at this image, we can think of several aspects. Yeah, so we see Arab, which is multinational, multi-billion company that's involved in diverse development projects, infrastructure, and in every June it changes its logo into rainbow colors to show its support of the LGBT community. And then we can ask ourselves, so is it cynical or is it true? Are they really for LGBT rights? If they were really into LGBT rights, then why are they building in Saudi Arabia or Russia? So is this double standards, and whether double standards are better than no standards at all? But this is not a question only of Arab, because we see this happening every June. Every company, almost if you open whatever, Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, you see that they change their logos. So we can ask ourselves whether is it real or is it cynical? Is there just a pinkwashing or marketing campaign, just a strategy to promote their image? So this, but shows us also the ability of, let's say, the market to hijack civil rights issues. And so we might ask ourselves, so is it good or is it bad? Whether it's a question that we should be asking, or is it at least they're using it, so using civil rights issue, even if it's in a bad context, in a cynical context, at least they're promoting them. But this always reminds me of this quote from Donald Draper from Mad Men, who said, "What you call love was invented by guys like me to sell nylons." And what I like about this quote is that it shows that this ability of, let's say, the market economy or the market itself to control almost everything we believe in. So in our daily life, and this remained in the back of my mind when I started working as an architect, because I was involved in the post 2008 construction boom, witnessed, I think, in every geographical context around the globe, maybe despite Spain and Italy. So I was working, building buildings, designing houses, and witnessed this firsthand, how the market started influencing more the most, let's say, sacred space, which is our home, where we all live. But when we think of the market, there's another quote I always like to mention, is this one from the late David Graeber, says that whenever someone starts talking about the free market, quote, it's a good idea to look around for the man with the gun, because he's never far away. And this, for me, is a way that shows that markets are not just there, they're not out of nowhere. They're always created by a state. So we should ask ourselves, what is the interest of the state to create a certain market? And so this thinking, let's say, of both Graeber and Donald Draper, this is what drove me to my questions during my PhD, and which revolved around privatized colonization. So analyzing how the real estate market was used by the state of Israel to promote its territorial project. And when we talk about Israeli settlements, we should always remember this. We're talking about the continuous century-long effort of promoting the Jewish national renaissance in Palestine through different endeavors, which include settlements. This began at the turn of the 20th century in the acts of land redemption, so redeeming the lands to the rightful owners. the initial focus was the famous rural and communal settlements that revolved around the pioneers and their new lifestyle. So this agricultural settlements, and slowly started giving way to reproduce modernist housing estates following the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, as a way to provide housing solutions to the large Jewish population, usually on depopulated Palestinian villages. And yeah, this was, let's say, the way in the 50s, 60s, or early 70s. And this began to change with the changing consumer patterns. And so territorial settlements and also their architecture and planning began changing and started answering, let's say, the individualistic and concerns of that fitted the new privatized and liberal or neoliberal local economy, promoting more, let's say, suburban settlements during the 1980s as a means to attract families, mainly middle and upper middle class, to areas of so-called national interests. And in the early 2000s, what happened is that they started promoting, the state began promoting a real estate market, or formation of a real estate market in the same areas, attracting developers, investors, and changing the urban architectural characteristics of these areas, and basically transforming both the urban and architectural product. And so what I was doing was focusing on this area. So this is the area between Israel and the occupied Palestinian West Bank, so-called the Green Line. I was analyzing case studies from the late 1970s and the early 2000s on both sides of the Green Line, and showing how this is like a continuous effort, does not really distinguish borders as a means to erase the border or to hide it. And I was showing how this evolved with the transforming means of production. And the incentive to locate new settlements continue to be the same, revolving around the same criteria, which is the three chets, or the three H's in English. So chasach, which is scarcity of Jewish settlements in an area; chatzitza, which is disconnecting Arab settlements; and chavira, which is joining Jewish settlements and creating a national territorial sequence. I call this strategy settle and rule, like divide and rule. But how this strategy was materialized changed, as we said earlier. And according to this matrix I was really keen on developing, that says that if earlier was let's say, the cultivating rule, it transformed to industrializing rule in the 50s and 60s, and then a privatizing rule, starting with the neoliberalization of the area, these pseudo rural settlements, and then state-led gentrification, massive urbanization, and current day financialisation. But all these measures were enacted by the state to facilitate the continuation of its geopolitical project in times of neoliberalism. So I finished this research, and as Irit says, there's a book coming out in April, hopefully. So thinking of marketing, maybe I can market it to you today. But when I was finishing the project, I started thinking whether there are any holes that we can find in it, or I can find in it, whether I can challenge it, whether the market is only cynical, whether if it's a free market, whether it could be used to promote some kind of freedom. Because we have to remember that privatization is the way, as it was enacted, usually as enacted, is never really truly clean way of privatization. It's always a selective mode of privatization. So if I think of one of the case studies that I had which was quite famous because of the Qa'dan family, which is the Palestinian family living nearby one of the settlements, and wanted to purchase a house and to move to it. They had to go to the Israeli High Court of Justice. So then it was not really privatization, because if it was just market economy, then they could have done it without any obstacles. But so if we can just look at the market, what happened here. So we have, let's say, a wealthy upper middle class Palestinian family who had the economic means to purchase a house in an Israeli settlement. So in that sense, neoliberalism could defy or contradict ethnic exclusion. Yeah? So it could defy colonization. So perhaps then neoliberalism and geopolitical state interests are not always allies. So this what led me to start asking these questions about the possibility of market-led decolonization. And yeah, so whether we can use it to confront settler-colonialism with the help of privatization. And start doing this by looking at the Palestinian Citizens of Israel and who they are, this peculiar group. So these are the surviving remnant. Yeah, these were the Palestinians, unlike the majority of Palestinians who were deported or fled, hundreds of thousands that were deported or fled from historical Palestine and became refugees. These ones are the ones that stayed within what became the State of Israel in 1948. They enjoy this bizarre status of being simultaneously Israelis and Palestinians. So they're not under official occupation, but they suffer from different forms of, let's say, institutional discrimination, of which and access to land is one. There's always, yeah, there are different ways how to refer to them. There's a depoliticized terms of Israeli Arabs or 48 Arabs. I like this one, which I saw recently in a Dutch newspaper, which they refer to as Israeli Palestinians. I would have liked to use that, but too many people would see it as an oxymoron. They cannot be both. So I like using, let's say, Palestinian Citizens of Israel. So highlighting the fact that their citizenship is that what differentiates them from other Palestinians, the ones who live in the West Bank and Gaza or numerous refugee camps around the Middle East. Though if someone can be an American Palestinian, they can also be Israeli Palestinians. Anyhow, we can just call them the PCI. You can lower, higher? Okay, higher? Okay, no problem. So being simultaneously Palestinian and Israelis, they inherently challenge the ethnic base of Israel's definition as the national home of the Jewish nation and all of its settler-colonial aspects. So, and if we think of settler-colonialism as both define it as an inclusive land-centered project where access to territory is the primary motive to replace or efface the native population. So they defy this zero-sum game of access to territory. So they challenge it just by being there, and continue to challenge it even more with the second or third generation of PCI, usually, which were, let's say, more. They had access to universities, became more mobile in economic terms, politically aware as well, like similar to other second and third generation of minorities, migrants, and native populations. And there are the ones that also began demanding for better living standards, like the aforementioned Kadan family. So taking a more active role in the ethnic-based process of spatial production in Israel. And so these efforts I would like to frame as privatized decolonization. And we will start talking about decolonizing gentrification, which is a term that I'm trying to develop actually with Chaim as well, so when we talk about gentrification, we usually think of this consistency between, let's say, hegemonic group or a majority group and economic status. But what happens when there is a lack of consistency, meaning whether the minority group is actually the one that has more economic means. And this leads to different form of gentrification that does not follow the same, or the usual modes of gentrification that we're aware of. And one of the most peculiar case studies is the PCI families in Upper Nazareth. So, and what happened is, so Nazareth is, I hope you all know the names, but historically known being the hometown of Jesus. But until 1948, it was quite marginal. It was less than 12,000 inhabitants, with main urban centers for the Palestinian community being Jaffa, Haifa, Jerusalem, Lydda, Akko, and other places. But these were lost during the war. And Nazareth was occupied, but the population was not deported for different reasons. But due to the fact that it was not deported, it became the urban center of the PCI community. So it began witnessing growth, severe growth, internal migration as well, and at the same time also desire from the state to control it. This is why in the early 1950s, the government began promoting a new Jewish settlement in the area. And as then Prime Minister Ben Gurion said, the Jewish settlement in Nazareth will reside on the mountains while the Arab settlement is located in the valley. That what gives us a significant military advantage. So the idea was that by constructing a Jewish settlement, then control the Arab one. And this new settlement planned by architects Sharon Edelson, let's say the main institutional architects of that time, resembled the common Israeli industrial development towns, ones that we saw before, intended to house newly coming immigrants, mainly from Romania, and reproduce modernist housing estates, in different forms. Actually, some of them interesting typologies, but it included also a very peculiar neighborhood in the fringes. This is special in terms of, let's say, aesthetics, low-rise patio houses that were included also local materials that was supposed to, that was intended for officers in the Israeli military, mainly the ones serving in the Northern Command. So at the same time, being a peripheral town, the Jewish population in Upper Nazareth was middle class. So working class, even the military officers, they were not, let's say, in economic terms, they were not upper class. Even though they were an elite, let's call it like this. But at the same time, in Nazareth, so Arab Nazareth, so being the urban center of the PCI population, you can witness in the 1970s, 1980s, this formation of a PCI bourgeois class that was looking now for better living standards and having also the means to do that. But with Nazareth being an Arab locality, it suffered from lack of development potential. So they could not fulfill their suburban or desire for better living standards in an Arab locality. So in their backyard, they had this settlement of Upper Nazareth, which began being the target of these families, and especially the lower-rise officers' neighborhood was being quite close to Nazareth and so the Arab Nazareth, and so they could just by crossing the street to the colony on the hill, they could just start improving their life, moving to a larger house. And if we look at we can map the changes in house occupants and by who purchased which houses when, we see that if in the 1970s this neighborhood was almost entirely Jewish, then by 2020 it's entirely Palestinian. And we have to remember we're talking about an ex-military neighborhood. So the fact that this changed is quite interesting, I have to say. So in that term, we have, let's say, middle class, working class neighborhood becoming upper class neighborhood. So in that sense, it resembles classic gentrification. But at the same time, we have to remember that we had a hegemonic group leaving and non-hegemonic group entering. So that does not really fit the normal gentrification patterns we're talking about, especially when we have to remember the veteran population had two incentives to leave. First of all, the rising prices. Second of all, they didn't want to live near their new Arab neighbors. And different demonstrations that were held in the 1970s and 1980s were precisely according to follow this object. They don't want to live near their Arab neighbors. They're afraid of their Arab neighbors. So it's quite a peculiar mode of gentrification, which in a way also we can say resembles what in the US they would call white flight. And this is, so in terms of gentrification, we see the architectural aspects of the neighborhood began changing. So if we had former small houses, these patio houses, they began turning into larger 3-story villas meant to, but this was not only, let's say, in terms of volume the change, but also in terms of aesthetics, which is also very apparent. That so what we had now is more, let's say, Arab characteristics or Palestinian characteristics, whether the columns, the arches, the rustic stone cladding, the circular windows that are typically Palestinian details. So this represents both, let's say, the house itself and its aesthetics, represents also the fact that they're more economically able, and it's a more, let's say, richer community, but at the same time it represents that there was a Palestinian richer community. So we can call this, and say, decolonial Nouveau Riche style in that sense. That defies this, the so-called clean Israeli architecture of the 1950s and the 1960s, and changes. So when we look at both images, what was then, what was now, we can think of many things, but what's really apparent is that it turned into an Arab neighborhood. And what started in the officer neighborhood affected all parts of Upper Nazareth, and by the early 2000s, the former colony, so current colony, turned into 25% Palestinian. So if we look at if we think, let's say, how white flight took place in American cities, and how gentrification took place also in American cities or worldwide, we see that here we have this combination of both. But that was generated by at least at the beginning, by the desires of PCI families for larger houses. So the suburban, this American dream of self-fulfilment. And this is what I would like to call the right to the suburb. Was something that quite crucial in spatial development, or in the attempts of Palestinians living in Israel to participate in the spatial development. And we see that this bourgeois class and its quest for suburban lifestyle continued in other places. So if we had, let's say, the decolonizing gentrification, we can also talk about decolonizing suburbanization, which is the case, let's say, of the Qaddan family and other presidents as well. But I like actually to talk about this particular case study, which is called Neve Shalom Wahed Salam, which is, it's quite unique. It's located midway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But it forms, you can say, a parallel universe to the surrounding environment, because it's the only locality between Jordan and the sea that was developed as a binational community, so housing both Palestinians and Israelis. They make up 50% of the current residents today. It started in the 1970s as an alternative communal village envisioned by this man, Bruno Hussar, a Dominican monk, who wanted to create a Christian, Jewish, Muslim community. There's an idea of, quite Christian idea of, let's say, reconciliation, talking together, living together. But it began, let's say, as a very alternative, even we could say hippie village, but it was the only option for Palestinian citizens of Israel to improve their living standards, to move to a new place, so not to be locked in their current neighborhoods or villages that were suffering from lack of development. And what we can see now, how it gradually changed. So if we look at the plan from the 1970s, early 80s, what we see is this communal place, this communal settling of small dwelling units, sharing an open space, where the most important thing is the school of peace in the middle. And by the early 2000s, actually 2015, the last plan that was drawn was quite suburban. So cul-de-sac street, private houses, large parcels, because what happened in the meantime was that it attracted many PCI families, Jewish families, but mainly PCI families. And for them, it was one of the only options to live, let's say, in the metropolitan area of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, or in between both of them, and to be welcome, and but also to buy a parcel and to build a house, which might sound as quite a simple demand, but in this context, it was not that simple. But this is what causes it to be today to one of the most, let's say, expensive places in the area. A house there costs something like £1 million. So it's we can think of who are the people who are able to live in that area, and whether only really upper class families are the ones who are able to live jointly in this binational community, or what it turned into a binational real estate project. And this combination of, let's say, upwardly rich families living together is what made it into a showcase of Israel. Mainly in foreign policy, in the attempt to depict the state as an open and welcoming country. So it forms the ideal place to bring outside visitors, like you see here, First Lady Hillary Clinton and First Lady Sarah Netanyahu in 1998, as a place to show, look how open we are. We have Israelis and Jews and Arabs living together in this communism of the rich. But here as well, we see also the same aesthetical changes. You can define according to simple aesthetics, and I did that actually, compared almost all houses in Neve Shalom. You can recognize in which house lives an Arab family and in which house lives a Jewish family. It's quite evident. You see that in the use, let's say, of Palestinian-like or Arab-like or Islamic architectural ornaments or details, like minarets and arches. And but so we can always start asking, so whether this desire to build one of these villas could be considered as decolonization. So it is quite bizarre when we think of it. So isn't just an act of self-expression? But if we return to the definition of settler-colonialism as a zero-sum game, then I think that even this cynical act of building a 300 square meter villa with arches and columns and Greek style, whatever that maybe is, even if only a neoliberalism way of thinking, a form of decolonization. And while in, let's say, Israel proper, so not in occupied territories, this privatized decolonization is only an outcome of small private endeavors. Then in the occupied West Bank, actually, we see that it could be part of, let's say, a more organized effort, despite or even because of occupation. So we can now witness today large-scale developments, finance-driven, real estate-driven, that defy Israel's territorial claims. Of course, the first example we all think of is Rawabi, developed by the Al Masri Corporation, being the first city or the first ever locality even in the West Bank after 1948. But this was, let's say, a one-off. And in the past 15 years, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Autonomy, has been acting to promote similar precedents, mainly through the Palestinian Investment Fund, which was established in the early 2000s to promote economic stability to the Palestinian Authority, as a way to create economic independence and to promote future independent states in the West Bank, corresponding with, let's say, President Fayyad's idea of, let's say, capitalist liberalization of Palestine. So the PIF, it has 6 sectors, 2 of which are real estate and land reclamation. So in that sense, we return to the first poster we saw of the land reclamation efforts by the Jewish National Fund in Palestine 100 years ago. So yeah, different real estate projects they have today are mainly small in the outskirts of existing cities, like the Rihan project in the outskirts of Ramallah, or Dahat al-Jinan, the Jinan neighborhood in the outskirts of Jenin. But in terms of land reclamation, these are larger, grander projects, much more, let's say, investment driven. Yeah, even the marketing strategy, the names that choose, they're much, let's say, quite American affiliated. So names like Sudra Hills or Desert Heights, yeah, might sound of somewhere in LA or something like this. But also the layouts are much suburban, much low rise. So it's also oriented to a specific class of Palestinians. The highlight of these efforts is Moon City in the Medinat al-Qamar in the Jordan Valley near Jericho, which, as Amar, the corporation in charge of its development, clearly stated, has a strategic importance, and it's promoted by them to, as quote they say, to defy Israel's territorial hostility, unquote. And when we look at what they're doing there, we look at the project, we see these villas, the luxurious tourism, spas all over it, university projects, and we might wonder whether this is what Palestine needs. And so is this like when we talk about Palestinians living in the West Bank, we usually affiliated with refugee camps. So when we think is okay, so is this going to solve, let's say, the Palestinian problem? So developing real estate for the 5 or 2% of Palestinians who can purchase it, by funding it through offshore investment firms, mainly from the Gulf. This is we're going to promote Palestinian independence. And when you listen or you read, you can scan it and see one of their promotion campaigns. And when you listen to these claims of Palestinian independence and land and fatherland, you can wonder whether it's just neoliberal mumbo jumbo intended to sell nylons, as Don Draper said, or in this case, condos. But actually, and it's a big but, when we start seeing the resistance or the panic that these projects cause in Israel, mainly from right wing, but also center wing Israelis and their NGOs and their campaigns, and their talk about, let's say, the Palestinian agenda, this conspiracy to take over the West Bank, to divide the Israeli settlement blocks, and to create a Palestinian sequence. One might wonder where they got the idea from, makes this neoliberal mumbo jumbo into a true form, even if very neoliberal, but in a true form of decolonization. And I will end by that, in a quote from Rachel Busbridge that said that if Palestine is being globalized, the globe is simultaneously being Palestinized. And I would like to say that if decolonization was liberalized, then neoliberalism is even if it's only slightly decolonized. And I will finish by that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the stand in front of the camera for the sake of our viewers at home. We have a few. Thanks for this fascinating talk, Gabriel. And yeah, it's really interesting how you've started one way and then flip things over, and including how it's very interesting how Israeli organizations use the same terminology on Palestinian settlements as the way that they act themselves. So it's fascinating. I think we will take. I have lots of questions. But for the sake of the people at home and people here, will take around 5 or 10 minutes break. You can have, you know, your own drinks at home, and we'll have a bit of drinks and crisps here. And then we'll reconvene for a session of Q&A questions and answers. So yes, you are invited to get a drink if you'd like.
Our drinks are better here.
Sorry?
Our drinks are better than
The one at home, yes. And also,
לא, אני חושב
הוא היה צריך פייסבוק בשביל זה.
אז זה מוחק כן, הוא גילה בפייסבוק שיש לו חברים של כולם, אז לא אמרתי לך, אני מדבר עם פייסבוק. ראיתי את זה.
עוד שם מסתבר, מסתבר את המסתברים על הכרסים שלך?
נראה לי שאולי שנוזרו
וזה הצפוי. אני חושב
לא, תאמין לי, זה
Again, hello all. So we'll do it. We'll arrange the Q&A session as I think we've done it last time. We'll ask people here in the audience or live here with us to ask questions if they have them. And if you have questions at home, please write them down in the Q&A or in the chat place in the webinar. In the webinar button on your screen. We can start. I mean, I can start with my own question, or if you have, I can start with the first one, I guess. When you talked about the gentrification of the neighborhood in Natsatelit, you compared it to the Kaadan family, and obviously there they had the local authority, municipality, or the community there objected Kaadan moving in to the settlement. And I was wondering whether the council, possibly, Jewish majority council or municipality in Natsatelit objected these moves as well, and if so, in what ways?
Of course. So in the 1970s, mainly early 80s, there were several endeavors that began by the local the Jewish community. They even had an organization called MENA, Megan South Elite, which is the defenders of Upper Nazareth and South Elite. And also the municipality tried to do that. Because what happened was the residents were even threatening the municipality that if you don't solve it, we're going to sell all our apartments to Arabs. So it's going to be, it's going to be on your conscience. And of course, that continued. And the highlight was after the second Intifada with the October demonstrations and the Yom Kippur in 2000, where in the demonstrations, two youngsters from Nazareth were killed by the police. And this escalated the situation even more. And that led to the election of Shimon Gapso as mayor, who was, his slogan for the election was Nazareth will remain forever Jewish. And one of the main, the first thing he did as mayor was to put a really large flag at each junction in the entrance to Upper Nazareth. And sorry?
Israeli flag.
Yes, sorry, what did I say?
No, just
yeah,
flag.
of course, yeah.
Of
course, it's and what the problem is that the municipality tried since the 80s to promote new projects. The problem is that what they did was always to build new suburban project, and at the end, all suburban projects turned into Arabs. And so they had two more military neighborhoods in the 80s and early 90s, turned Arab. The Russian immigration that came in the early 1990s was supposed to fight that as well. So if the Russian immigration would come in the early 1990s, the population, they would have been 25%, Palestinian would have been more than 50%. The thing is that the municipality now knows that it cannot fight the Arab population through the market, let's call it this. So what they're doing now is attracting ultra-Orthodox population, which is who are economically, let's say they are the weakest in economic terms in Israel, say the poorest population, but they're Jewish. So they are developing special neighborhoods for them. So in that sense, what happens is that the gentrification that it didn't, so in order to stop gentrification, the municipality is actually diminishing the demand to live in that area. So it's deteriorating the socioeconomic status of the town on purpose, yes.
And were the planners also kind of struggling in terms of, style of housing? You described very nicely how the modern style has changed. You have a more Palestinian style. So were they fighting against it also in terms of planning approvals due to these changes, for example?
Well, I have to say that it's quite a peripheral municipality in that sense, so they will not go as far as that. Okay. But in terms, let's say, of there's always a debate on decorations during Christmas or during the Eid, whether they're allowed or should, or whether they put a Christmas tree in the mall in Nazareth, whether that's something that's because actually the majority of Palestinians living in Upper Nazareth are Christian, which makes it even a more bizarre case. So putting Christmas tree and all of a sudden becomes an issue of national struggle.
Okay, yes.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was fascinating. I found the term decolonizing gentrification really captures well the process where the minority group takes over and takes like financial means to change certain neighborhoods and to become their own, right? But I'm wondering, what are the limits of decolonizing gentrification? In what cases can you say, okay, this is like market-led gentrification and not decolonizing gentrification? And also, maybe you give examples from the West Bank occupied territories of this process, and I wonder if there are similar processes like in large Israeli cities, like in Jaffa, for example, like this cities in Jaffa or in Haifa, can we see this process of decolonizing gentrification?
I will start with the last question. There was this bizarre series of articles in Haaretz 2 months ago about the house of, actually he's a professor in Machon Weizmann called Yaoub Hanna. And so it was an article written by Naama Riba, my personal opinion on her side, but she wanted to show that even Palestinians in Jaffa, they promote gentrification. So she was analyzing the aesthetics of his house and the fact that he's quite wealthy and his house is worth 15 million shekels, which is about 3-4 million pounds. So that Palestinians are doing the same problems, the same attitudes as rich Jewish Israelis. My question was how come a university professor has the ability to buy a house in Jaffa, but we'll put that aside. But he answered back. He wrote his own opinion on it, and he said that one of the things he said that it was so the entire discourse was led by his Jewish Ashkenazi upper class left liberal neighbors who didn't want to have an Arab in their street. So I think that even there we can still speak about in a way, and he even mentioned that he bought the house from the former owner of Betar Yerushalayim, which is a right-wing football club. So I think that even then it's very, very cynical. We can still speak a little bit because it still has this aspect. I think whenever the ethnic part is still playing a role, we can still turn it like that. But we have to remember that the problem of this, say, if we go to the Nazarene case, is that at the end, when you look at what these bourgeois families, Arab families had to pay, it's astronomous. With the price that they paid for a quite small house there, a Jewish family could buy a much better house. But these houses are usually community settlements where Palestinians have no access to. So in that sense that they have to pay much more than, so there's a price cap where they have to pay at least 15 to 20% more. This is what I think. So in that sense, what happens is that at the end, you are creating closed compounds for a specific ethnic group, even if it's a rich neighborhood, because it has access only, the gentrification can take part only in a really small place. It cannot continue growing. Yes.
Sorry, we have I can see now that we have Q&A from the audience at home. And Gabriel, if you could stand to the camera, they'll be able to see you. Great. So one of the questions by an anonymous attendee is asking, he or she are asking, thanking you for the interesting presentation. I would like to challenge that, don't you think neoliberalism is becoming the modern form of urban colonialism?
Of course. So this is one of the questions, whether we can, and it's still an open question at the end, whether let's say defying ethnic-based segregation on the one hand and enforcing or continuing economic-based segregation on the other could form any mode of decolonization. But yeah, as we see it today, worldwide, yeah, neoliberalism is colonization, is trying to find, let's say, a way to say run between the raindrops.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think we should always discuss that when we're discussing decolonizing architecture. I mean, what is its meaning and context, and what do we mean by when we are saying decolonizing architecture? What kind of fields are active in it? And it's this kind of in this as part of this term. So yes,
I was just discuss when you're talking about the mixed suburban neighborhoods, you talk very much about the buildings, but you didn't really discuss the spaces in between. So is there public space and amenities that are used by both Arabs and Israelis within these neighborhoods?
Well, thank you for the question. It's really really important to talk about these issues. Usually there are let's say the parks are but it's also a question of who uses them and when. This is why, let's say, access to parks is one of the most burning questions today. Many localities are trying to limit Arab access, or let's say in Nazareth, or Jewish Nazareth, there's the communal, what they call the country club, which is basically a swimming pool. But it's deliberately closed on Sundays, which is the resting day for most Palestinians living in Upper Nazareth. So the question is, and it's not, it's a clear act of, let's say, closing it. And what happens is that the common places are usually, let's say, the place of encounter and the place of conflict. So if we talked about the demonstrations that took place in 2000, it was the open places where they took place. And but let's say the open places are usually also the places for conflict. So every struggle, let's say, on a bench or a parking place becomes an ethnic question.
Thanks. Chaim, will let you, and then sorry. Yeah. Okay. I think it's a question which relates to your question and to the whole kind of discussion which runs between neoliberalism and decolonization. What are your thoughts on neoliberalism, capitalism that is still informed by racial, ethnic inequality? Do you think that capitalism can ever be divorced from racialization and the creation of a power hierarchy through race, since social economical status is still intrinsically tied with race today? So that's a question from Tiffany.
Well, actually, I have to say, I should have said at the beginning, I'm a neo-Marxist. I think that no, but I think that we cannot divide that. But at the same time, this is why I brought the example of Arab at the beginning. When at the end, and let's say in a bank, it doesn't really matter what your color is or what your sexual orientation. It's as long as you're bringing money. So in that sense, earning money or bringing in profits is something that can dismantle the question of race sometimes. But as we have to say that there is no thing as a free market, but ideally it should. Practically, I'm quite skeptic. But the question is whether we can find, let's say, it's not the framework is not, let's say, let's promote decolonization through neoliberal endeavors, but to understand how decolonization is promoted sometimes in small specific places and small case studies here and there through neoliberal means. But let's say as an overall agenda, yeah, of course not. It's going to continue deteriorating everything. But some places can see something blossoming.
And maybe it's important also to, just as a note, to kind of put brackets on it as, in colonialism that is specifically settler-colonialism. So maybe in other colonial contexts or post-colonial context, the whole kind of framework is different. And then there, neoliberalism is actually a form of colonization. But yeah, you can.
Well, I think personally, my opinion is that there's no difference between, at least in the initial phase, between settler-colonialism and colonialism. The only difference is that white men were able to stay. And the fact that they were able to stay is usually a question of climate, not a question of choice. They would have liked to stay everywhere. It was either too hot or too humid, or that their vegetation or the crops didn't grow. Because at the end, the settler colonialism, all the places colonized by, let's say, white nations that resemble in terms of climate and geography Europe.
Okay, we can discuss later on in time. Professor Chaim Yaakov from DPU UCL is here with us.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I think it was much more provocative than maybe people here in the room think. So thank you very much. I have one comment and one question or thought to share with you, and I'm interested to see what you think about it. First of all, I would like to thank you for bringing class into the discussion, because the phenomena of Palestinians gentrifying neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods in Israel, is very much linked to the growing strata of, I would say, bourgeoisie Palestinians. And I think it is important to say it. And I think that, it characterizes not just the case of Nazareth, but also, Carmiel, East Jerusalem, where Palestinians are moving to Jewish settlements, Omer, Beersheba. They have a very specific, I would say, class profile. And I think it is important to mention it. And I refer to the work of Rabbi Novich and Abu Bakr about Ador HaKe'ed, the proud Palestinian generation. And I think it's important to contextualize it. My other question is, I feel sometimes uncomfortable with the term decolonization. And the reason is that for me, decolonization is not just about, the presence of marginalized minorities, groups, racial groups, ethnic groups in a wide space. I think decolonization is really about the redefinition of power, the redefinition of the distribution of resources, including land, housing, infrastructure, etc., etc. And I think that what we can see in the case that you presented of Nazareth, and I think we can see it in other cases, is not very much decolonization, but the paradox that Israeli settler-colonial state produced or created. On the one hand, you have Palestinians who are citizens, but not fully citizens, we all know it. On the other hand, free market, so if you have the money, you can buy whatever you want. And we know that it's not true. In some neighborhoods, there are specific communities that do not allow Palestinians to buy property. So we should also mention it. So I think that we should maybe refer to decolonization as a process, as an ongoing process. And as you mentioned, decolonization, or even if it's a symbolic decolonization, also creates a reaction from the state. Like having more communities to control demographic balance between Jews and Arabs in specific cities or in specific neighborhoods. Legal actions that are taken in order to avoid the infiltration of Palestinians into Jewish neighborhoods. And even the very symbolic act of renaming Nazareth, Upper Nazareth, into Nova Galil, the Galilee landscape. It's the new name of Nazareth, not to call it Nazareth, so you don't identify it, with the Arab nature of the region, I would say. So I think that maybe, first of all, my question is, maybe it's not a decolonization, it's an ongoing decolonization. And the other thing has to do, with understanding it as the paradox that the settler-colonial state produce on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I don't think that's like the way to decolonize space, but I think when we look at it, is a way that space was, even if only slightly, decolonized. So it's this paradox, and I think that by understanding these paradoxes, even if in a small case study, we can understand how colonization could be, or colonialism could be dismantled, or is dismantled, or challenged. And I think that whenever it is challenged, we can start speaking of decolonization. So whenever, let's say, the power structure is even moved a bit, starts shaking, we can start talking about it. And because we know that all Arab presence in the landscape is something that, let's say, the settler-colonial state or the settler-colonial aspects or approach of Israel is something that it's not tolerable. And whether it's ruins, castles that are usually called the Crusaders' castles, changing the names, as Melvin Venisti showed us. And even today, when you see it in many divided cities or binational cities, or of erasing the Arab names of streets. So this act of constantly getting rid of all Arab residues, whether it's natural landscape, built landscape, village, rural context, or in the city, if that is, let's say, the settler-colonial perspective, that everything that brings that presence back, even if it's 3 million euros villa with minarets and arches, I think we can still frame it as some form of decolonization. Very cynical one, but yes. And the question is whether, and the question of class connects, I think, to the former question as well, whether we expect sometimes from the Palestinian citizens of Israel too much, to defy neoliberalism, to defy market economy, to defy settler, but they need something. Huh? And if this is the only thing that they have, these are the tools that they have, and this is what they can do.
Wow. Yeah. Well. Yeah. It's starting.
It's really fascinating. But I agree with Chaim about the East also. It might be convenient that in architecture terms, there is a kind of some sort of decolonizing the space. But when thinking about the facilities that these families would take them, this will bring us to think about the sociological processes that they go through. Especially in education, where these families and their children will abandon Arabic altogether, their children themselves. And this is the antithesis of decolonizing, even when we accept it in some form. There is a study now in Nova Galil. It's better to call it Nova Galil for me than the Upper Nazareth because of the very meaning of Upper
lower.
So there's now a big struggle for them to establish a school or at least a class where children, Palestinian children, can learn in Arabic, their mother tongue. So this is one of the posts that touch within the very basic or pure component of the identity, say language, and other things. After language, there is the holidays and other things that are related to this. So speaking architecture, we still need to look from a perspective of sociological point of view because this is very interconnected.
Of course. No, I agree with you. And this is the reason why I chose Nazareth as a case study, because this is why I think it differs from other places where similar processes have been taking place, mainly because the connection to the real Nazareth was maintained. So the majority, the vast majority, they can swear without even checking the statistics twice, that 99% of Arab children living in Jewish Nazareth go to school in Arab Nazareth because it's still nearby. Most Arabs living in Jewish Nazareth still work in Lower Nazareth, and this is so. This in that sense differs, let's say, from Carmel or Haifa, because they can still maintain. Say they can still go to the church or mosque or whatever they want to, or the mall usually in Nazareth without, say, losing their identity. And one of the interesting things that, for example, the officers' neighborhood is one of the only places in Jewish Nazareth that is open to car traffic during Yom Kippur, which other parts are closed. So in that sense, it became, let's say, a real Arab exclave of, let's say, real Nazareth and Jewish Nazareth. And by the way, most Arab residents of Jewish Nazareth agree with you. They also were for changing the name into something neutral, to lose the Arab affiliation in that sense that, no, there is Nazareth and there's this Jewish colony over there, which we might live in, but it's not Nazareth. So it's, yeah. But the thing is that you have to ask yourself, why was the change? Why was the name changed? It was changed not because they want to respect Arab Nazareth, but in order to draw the ultra-Orthodox community, which would not live in a place called Nazareth, which has a very, let's say, Christian affiliation to it, not precisely Arab. So for an ultra-Orthodox community to live in a place which is called, if you translate it literally from Hebrew, Christiania, that is something that's unheard of. But yeah, I think you're correct in many of your comments.
Great, we have two more. So Lou? Yeah.
And thank you for your talk. That was incredibly interesting. I just wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier in one of your quotes when you talked about, when we talk about the free market, there's always someone holding a gun. And I was just thinking of what you said earlier about the bank. If someone comes into a bank, maybe we can make abstraction of everything else as long as they bring money. But in itself, that system is rigged in the sense of, for example, African Americans trying to get mortgages and having at least less than half of the same chance as white people doing it, or gay couples trying to adopt and having half the chance of straight couples adopting, all these kind of things. If the system, exactly like you're describing about the free market, is already made with a bias, then it's executed and only delivered to certain people with that bias. And so I guess I was really curious, because I'm quite new to this specific topic that you just talked about, of what is that system and how is it in place in those settlements or those neighborhoods? How does it happen that this sort of gentrified hacking of Palestinians, how does it happen? What is the system in place where people Palestinian families are allowed to buy this land or to buy this plot or to buy this house and to incrementally do it? And who are they? Those Palestinians, I thought if you could give us some context, it would be great.
I think Professor Jacobi once termed it as the Arab gap, the
additional price.
Yeah, and an Arab topping. I would call it, Arab topping. Usually Arabs would have to pay a substantially higher price than a Jewish family wanting to buy the same apartment. So in a sense, every Jew or every Palestinian selling an apartment to a Jew or the other way around, so selling, let's say, a piece of land or apartment or real estate or whatever to a member of the other group would be seen as a traitor. It's not done. It's not done. But if for a certain price it is done. This is how most of the Zionist reclamation campaigns were done. Basically buying the way free market, just buying a quite large sum of money. But in that terms, so in that sense, and it connects, let's say, to the neoliberal facade that we think that everyone is equal, because we know that minority groups, in order to get the same possibilities as majority groups, will have to be much better. So for, let's say, for an African American to get an American university, a really good university, has to be much better, or she has to be much better, let's say, than her, say, WASP colleagues. So in that sense, it also comes with a price. They have to be more. It's as simple as that. But, hope that answers your question.
So there are no legal obstacles around.
Well, that's the thing. So in
that location,
in urban settlements, there are no legal obstacles. In rural ones, or in suburban ones, where they have this called community settlements, they have an admissions committee, and they have to approve. It was the case of the Kardan family. So the admission committee has to approve whether, let's say, a sale or a transaction could go through. And there they can impose their limits. There are other, let's say, not institutional obstacles, but let's say in a way also market driven, because what in other contexts real estate developers fear, not in that context, but say in other places like, let's say, Lid or Ramle, they fear that Arab residents will what they usually do, lower real estate prices. So they will create, let's say, parallel marketing campaigns that deliberately go around, let's say, the Arab community. So they will go through, let's say, word of mouth, or they would publish only to a certain sector in a certain language, hang the phone when an Arab customer calls. So there are different ways to do that that are, in that sense, not that different, let's say, from the US, if not today, then at least 20 or 30 years ago.
My question was to do with, well, was mentioned before that this aspect of class was really important, and I am wondering where this particular class of Palestinians come from, or Arabs, I guess, in the sense that you also mentioned, for example, that Arabs would, for example, given the availability, Arab children would still go to Arab schools, and Arab workers would still go to places they could, you know. Are these the Arabs that also have an opportunity to reach that specific sort of class and then, well, decolonize through gentrification, or is these class that is much more like imported from abroad?
Oh, it's a good question.
What does that imply in the context of gentrifying and decolonizing?
No, but actually, this class is an internal class, and the schools that most Palestinian citizens of Israel go to are Arab schools, usually private schools with some affiliation to one church or another. But it does not mean that they're the majority is Christian. There will also be a majority of Muslim students. But so in that sense, what happened to the Palestinian community inside Israel, education, university education, turned into, let's say, the method to improve your status. This is why, for example, one of the Palestinian localities in Israel today has the highest percentage of physicians per capita, not in Israel, but worldwide. And if you go to a hospital in Israel, the physician treating you will most likely be Palestinian. So there are these professions, usually doctors being also something, it has also a social capital to it. So education, university education is something that is, let's say, the way to do that, the way to obtain and to at least try, or in one way or another, to fight back. So you cannot fight back literally, but you can do that through your profession, which is something that's quite similar to other minority groups that you see, I think, also in the UK, but also in the US. If you go to I'm quite sure that if you go to a hospital in the US, the majority of physicians will not be WASPs. They'll be in the banks, because this is where you make money. But same thing here. Also, most physicians are not white, or at least they are less than the white percentage in population.
Yeah, and I think an important part of the question was about Palestinians or others coming from abroad. It doesn't happen, right? I mean, it's very difficult to, for particular, I guess, what could be minority groups in Israel to come from abroad and gain citizenship if they are not Jewish.
No, actually, what happened is we can see in some of the ones in the West Bank, some of the project was seeing there, I gave there. They have quite a big substantial percentage of Palestinians coming from the US.
In the West Bank.
Yes, So they will live 20, 30 years and they want to retire or want to have a second home, or they went to the US to, let's say, to make money, and now they come back. And some interviews I was seeing with them is that many of them would say that, yeah, this house here is quite similar to what I had in the US. So this is American dream of Palestinians is something that, when we see that spatially, let's say, in at least in urban design, with this car-oriented American Levy town model in the West Bank. And, but in the Palestinians in Israel, you're right. Yeah, that's usually, say, an internal group of worldly families.
Okay, great. I mean, we need to end soon unless you have the urgent question. I see that we have no questions online. No. Okay, so we can end here by thanking. Really, thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you.
Dr.
Enjoyed it. Thanks.
I'll leave the wine and crisps here. Yeah, another glass. Right.